This week's portion, Lech Lecha, deals with a subject that is, to this day, not very clear. Where was the beginning? Where was the genesis, or when was the genesis of the Jewish people? Who was the first Jew is another way of putting it. And, of course, the answer that most people have heard is that Abraham was the first Jew. It's not clear where that source is, that Abraham was the first Jew. The Talmud does mention that Abraham was the father of all converts to Judaism. So it stands to reason that if he was the father of all the converts, he was the first convert to Judaism, so he was the first Jew, because everyone else was not Jewish. But at what point did he become a Jew? And what does that mean that he was a Jew? When we use the word Jew, we refer to the title as a member of a nation to whom God gave the Torah and are bound by all of its commandments. Is there any suggestion that Abraham was bound by all 613 commandments? Of course not, because the 613 commandments were not given until Mount Sinai, a few hundred years later, after Abraham. The fact that the Talmud says that Abraham observed all the commandments simply means that he anticipated the commandments prophetically, and he observed those commandments that he was not obligated to observe. He volunteered them. So Abraham could not be considered the first Jew in the sense that he had the obligations of every Jew. He had the same obligations as all other members of humanity, known as the 7 Noahide commandments. And in addition, he was given the mitzvah, the commandment of circumcision, which we read about in this week's Torah portion. So Abraham, if he was a Jew, he was a Jew in a limited way. And the best way of understanding the definition of what it means that Abraham was a Jew is that God selected him to be the father or the progenitor of a nation to whom God will entrust his master plan for the world, the Torah. And God was looking for a person, an individual, who would be worthy of starting the process that would lead to Mount Sinai. And Abraham was therefore chosen, just like the Jewish people were chosen at Mount Sinai. Abraham was chosen to be the father of those people. According to one of the great Talmudic luminaries of the 20th century, known as the Rogachover, Rabbi Yosef Rosen, according to him, Abraham was not the first Jew until the Torah was given at Mount Sinai, and at that point he was retroactively a member of the Jewish people, because Abraham's actions led to the giving of the Torah to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai. But let me explain this on a little bit of a deeper level. When God created the world, and this is very fundamental to understanding what is our role in this world. When God created the world, God as an architect, as a builder, would certainly have a purpose in that venture of creation. God would not just create something without any reason, without any purpose, without any objective. And of course, Judaism is based on the belief that the purpose of creation was that there would be a master plan for the world contained in the Torah that would be given to human beings, and the idea was that they should spread this teaching to all the Jewish people, and from them the light would spread to the whole world, and the world would become a godly world. Now, in order for this plan to make any sense, it has to be a plan given to beings who are sentient beings, people capable of choosing. Because if God gave it to robots, automatons, angels, they are programmed beings, and if they are the ones to whom God entrusts the Torah and they execute God's commandments, it's God doing it. They're not doing it because they're programmed. the computer spits out material and information, it's not the computer that does it, it's the one who programmed the computer, who entered the information into the computer. So God had to create a being that on one hand had free choice. Free choice meant that God had to give a human being the ability to say to God, thank you, but no thank you. I'm not interested. Though the person would be punished, the person would suffer consequences, but that doesn't force the person to comply. So God on one hand wanted we should all have free choice, that we could choose to do the right thing or not. At the same time, if God wants his plan to finally take root and come to fruition, there has to be some type of a guarantee that the plan will be put into practice. But if you give someone free choice, how could that happen? So the answer is you need a nation. You need an entire nation of people who, for better or for worse, will ultimately reach the point where they implement God's plan. That it's an inevitable, inexorable process that doesn't take away free choice from every individual. For example, and I'll use elections I don't know why I'm using elections as a metaphor, but if we have polls taken, not like the present polls, that show that one candidate has 90% of the electorate and the other candidate only 10%, we know for sure, and any betting person would say, I will bet everything I have that this person who has the 90% will win. Yet every individual has free choice to vote one way or the other. No one is compelled because we know the outcome. That's the outcome based on the aggregate. So therefore God says, I'm going to create a nation that will have the power to guarantee that this plan will come to fruition, will be executed, will be implemented sooner or later. But ultimately it will happen within a prescribed period of time. If the Jewish people had behaved the way God wanted them to behave, Mashiach, which means the ultimate implementation of the plan, would have come hundreds of years ago or maybe thousands of years ago. Because we didn't implement the plan the way we should have, it's taking longer. But as we were told by the great luminaries of the last few centuries, and especially the Rabbi, that we are at the cusp of the Messianic age. We're reaching the very end of that process. At any rate, God needed a nation. But how do you get a nation? You can't just take a nation randomly and say, I'm going to choose you to become the nation that will spread the teachings of the Torah to the world and implement the master plan. So you have to start with an individual. So God starts with one individual, Adam. Adam and Eve were initially one person, and they were divided into two. And God has two or three tests to see if you are capable of being the right person from whom will emerge a family that will become a nation that will be able to survive all of the tests of time and ultimately succeed in implementing that plan. So God creates Adam and he gives him the first test. Don't eat the fruit of the forbidden tree. And Adam blows it and he violates that commandment. So God says, with all due respect to you, Adam, you're not the person who I could trust that will have the children that will lead to a nation that will bring about the implementation of my master plan. So God looks for another volunteer or another candidate, and he finds Noah. Noah passes the first test with flying colors. He resists the temptations of the entire world. Everyone is against him. He doesn't buckle, he doesn't bend. He is righteous, and the Torah describes him, and he's the only one described as such, as a tzaddik, a righteous, tamim, a perfectly righteous person. So God says, wow, I have a candidate. But then he has the second test. The second test is, can you influence others? Could you inspire others? Could you be a source of light to others? Because that's necessary in order for you to make this plan a reality. So what does Noah do? He builds the ark. It takes him 120 years to build the ark, and he didn't succeed in influencing even one person besides his own family. And that was the very purpose of God asking him to build the ark, Rashi tells us, so that people will ask him, why is this old man building a ship? And he would tell them, because God is bringing a flood on the world unless you repent. And presumably, Noah did what he was told to do, to try to rebuke people and try to inspire them, and he failed. So Noah did not have the charisma to influence others. So God says, you know what? You're a nice guy. I love you. And I'm going to give your children the 7 Noahide commandments because I want you to be the father of humanity in the sense of bringing the world to a state where it's civilized, a good world, a civilized world, an inhabitable world, but it's not the master plan. For that, God waited another 10 generations. There were 10 generations from Adam to Noah, another 10 generations from Noah to Abraham. There were some righteous people in both of these interim periods, but none of them could qualify and pass both tests. And now Abraham comes on the scene, and he passes the second test with flying colors. Even before God gives him instructions, Abraham discovers the futility of idolatry, how stupid it is, and he breaks idols. He puts his life on the line, and he spreads the knowledge of one God as he discovers the idea of one God, of monotheism, to thousands and thousands of people. He and Sarah were the greatest models of charisma and inspiration. They were the ultimate influencers. And God says, look, you passed both tests. I will give you the special privilege of being chosen, that you will be the father of this great nation. But it's not the end of the test, because even though you could be charismatic, you could spread things, there's no guarantee for the future. You have to have a family that has accepted and adopted the master plan, or the preparations for the master plan. And Abraham was one person. Abraham and Sarah were 2 people. And Abraham has 8 children. Sarah bore him 1 son, but he had Hagar and Keturah, another 7 sons. And he was only able to influence positively 1 of his 8 sons. That means that you could be the greatest tzaddik, you could have charisma, you could inspire thousands of people, but your own family members are sometimes the most difficult ones to make sure that they're going to adopt your ways of life and your philosophy. So Abraham passes it down to Isaac. Isaac succeeds in transmitting it to one other generation, to Jacob, not to Esau, his other son. And Jacob finally, the 3rd generation, there's a biblical verse that a 3-fold strand, when you tie something 3 times, 3 knots, it's not going to unravel. Here's the 3rd knot, Jacob, and he is able to transmit his values, for better or for worse, not perfect, to all his 12 sons. With all their rivalry and all their hatred of Joseph, basically they adopted Jacob's ideals, which were Abraham and Isaac's ideals, which were the foundation of the Torah that would be given later on at Mount Sinai. So here God has a nation, that a family that will now emerge into a nation in Egypt, where they will be subjected to the 2 major tests that Jewish people have been subjected to throughout Jewish history. One test was persecution, and the other test is assimilation, the threat and the enticement of assimilation. And again, they barely passed the test, but the Jewish people came out of Egypt. They didn't fail. They came out, and they were ready after 49 days of preparation to receive the master plan. Where did it all begin? It all began with Abraham. So Abraham was the first Jew, but at what point that means he was chosen to be the one that would advance the cause of the Torah, that would bring about the purpose for which the world was created. So if the Jewish people are defined as the people to whom God gave the master plan, namely the Torah, Abraham was the first step in that process. Noah is not considered the first Jew. He was a righteous person, and we trace ourselves back to him, obviously, but he was not the one to whom God entrusted the role of being the progenitor of the Jewish people that would bring God's plan to fruition. So that's the story of Abraham, the first Jew. Now, God At one point, did Abraham become the first Jew? So there are different opinions about that. Some say that it happened when God tells him, as the Torah portion begins, Lech lecha, go away from your land, from your birthplace, and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. This is the first time God is addressing Abraham, at least the first time we read about it in the Torah, that God is addressing Abraham and giving him a mission to cut him away from the rest of society, singling him out, choosing him to be unique. Some say that Abraham's chosenness began at the time of circumcision, when God made a covenant with him, an eternal covenant, and the covenant is circumcision, which involves the reproductive organ, as if to say, this is going to be the beginning of a nation, a family of people that will be tracing themselves back to you as the first Jew, and they will be the ones to carry on the whole purpose for which God created the world, which will ultimately lead us to the Messianic age. So God tells Abraham to leave, and then he promises him a few things. He says, I will make you of a great nation, I'll make of you a great nation, I will bless you, and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. So Rashi says the following, that these three blessings allude to the patriarchs, all the patriarchs. When God says, I will make you into a great nation, this refers to what we say in our prayer, the Amidah, the Shmona Esrei, the primary prayer. We say, Elokei Avraham, in the first blessing, the God of Abraham. When it says, I will bless you, that refers to that which we say in our prayers, Elokei Yitzchak, the God of Isaac. When it says, and I will make your name great, this is when we say, God of Jacob. Then Rashi says, one would perhaps think that we conclude with all the three patriarchs. When we say the blessing in the Shmona Esrei, we conclude with the words, blessed are you, God, the shield of Abraham. So one would think we should conclude the shield of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. No, we only conclude with Abraham. This is a statement that Rashi makes, and it's taken from the Talmud, that we conclude the blessing only with Abraham. What exactly is this all about? Why would we start with all the patriarchs and then conclude with Abraham? Why not conclude with all? And what's the significance of bringing in all the patriarchs here? So commentaries explain that the three patriarchs represent the three prongs upon which all of Judaism is based. And as I mentioned before, that Abraham was the one who was starting this process of leading to the giving of the Torah. This process began with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob because they represent the three pillars. What are the three pillars? Abraham personified the trait of kindness, of benevolence, of love. Abraham was known for his hospitality. He was known for his love for humanity. He prayed for even the people of Sodom. Isaac is connected to the trait of service, of prayer. Isaac was a sacrifice. The prayers are in place of the sacrifices. Isaac was a person whose service to God was one of devotion, of servitude, one who was constantly introspecting and subjecting himself to scrutiny and judgment, which is what prayer is. Prayer is an introspective experience where we connect to God by delving deeper into who we are and purifying and refining ourselves. And that's another pillar of Judaism, prayer. And then you have Jacob. Jacob is associated with Torah study. Jacob, it says, his Yoshev Oholim, he dwelled in tents. And our sages define that as referring to the tents of Torah. Jacob represented the teachings of Torah. Even though the Torah was not yet given, the Talmud tells us that, as I mentioned earlier, the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, were exposed to the teachings of Torah, and they kept the commandments voluntarily. But they were steeped in Torah. But of all the three patriarchs, Jacob was the one who was mostly associated with Torah. So we have three pillars. Judaism is based on these three: either the mitzvahs that we do that relate to how we deal with others, the mitzvahs that we do how we relate to God, and the study of Torah. So the question is, throughout Jewish history, we've done all three. We've excelled in all three. Some places, sometimes more than others. Which of these three pillars is the one which will clinch the victory, which will end the period of preparation for the Messianic age? And the answer is Abraham. Yes, Torah will never lose its importance. Prayer will never lose its importance. But the final stages of exile before the redemption, the dominant trait of Judaism will be acts of kindness. And we cannot compare the knowledge of Torah to our forebears. We cannot compare a devotion and prayer to our ancestors. They were ahead of us. But in terms of kindness, the Jewish people have exemplified the greatest levels of charity, of all forms of kindness, more than any other nation in the world, but not only more than any other nation, more than the Jewish people have ever done. So while we highlight the fact that we have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we need all three, the conclusion is that it's Abraham, that it's Abraham's trait, that is going to lead us to the conclusion. Later on in the Torah portion, it talks about the covenant that God made with Abraham between the pieces. We're not going to go into this whole covenant, except that that's where God promises Abraham that he is going to inherit the land of Israel. So let's talk a little bit about the land of Israel and what's going on in the world today. We see, and it's very troubling, the way anti-Semitism has expanded, accelerated, and it seems to be based on the hatred of the Jewish people's presence in Israel, as they use the term, the misnomer, the occupation, that we are occupying someone else's land. But everyone knows, and it's acknowledged by any objective person, that the hatred of the Jewish people today has nothing to do with Israel, because the people hated us when we didn't have Israel. They tortured us when we didn't even have the faintest sense that we would be able to be living in Israel again. This is all a great miracle that we're able to be in Israel today. This is something that we prayed for, we believed it would happen, but we certainly didn't think that it could happen in our lifetime if we'd go back hundreds and thousands of years. And yet, the hatred of the Jewish people was never something that disappeared because we didn't have Israel. And today you could see that the people who attack us because of what's going on in Israel are not really sincere in their opposition to what we do in Israel, because other nations have done much more damage to others. There are many more people dying in all other different countries, and no one cares about people dying in Ukraine. No one cares about people dying in Sudan, in Syria, and so on, and other places. So it's clear that the hatred of the Jewish people because of Israel is not because of Israel, it's because of the occupation. It's not because of the occupation, rather, it's because we are Jewish. So my question is, so why is it being so connected to Israel? It seems that Israel is a lightning rod for the hatred of Jews, because it demonstrates that the Jewish people have a symbiotic relationship with Israel. It's not as if there are two things. There's a Jewish people and there's a Jewish homeland, and the two could be separated. No, they cannot be separated. And this is supported by the first Rashi in the Torah. The first Rashi explains why it is that the Torah, which is a book of laws, at least that's how we perceive it, why does it tell us the whole story of Genesis? The whole book of Genesis is not about laws, it's about history, creation, the patriarch, Noah, the flood, the Tower of Babel, the patriarchs, Joseph and his brothers, and then the little bit of Exodus is about the bondage in Egypt, the slavery, and then the Exodus. And after that, when you start dealing with the Exodus, that's where you first get commandments. So Rashi's answer is, this is intended, the whole story of creation and the patriarchs is intended to be a response to the nations of the world that accuse us of stealing their land, that we conquered the land that belonged to the 7 Canaanite nations, that we are thieves. So the answer to them is that no, God created the world, he gave it to the Canaanites initially, and he took it from them and gave it to us. So my question is, and the question that everyone asks, the nations of the world in the days of Rashi were complaining that we stole the land. When did Rashi live? Rashi lived 900 plus years ago. In Rashi's days, there were hardly any Jews living in Israel. This is the time of the Crusades. The Muslims and the Christians were the ones inhabiting Israel. There were always Jews there, to be sure, but a tiny Jewish community existed in those days. And yet people were still complaining that we stole the land from them. What did we steal? If we were occupying the land as we are today, quote, I put the words occupying, quote, unquote, if that would be the case, well, okay, it makes a little bit of sense. But this is the time when the Jews didn't live in Israel. And the answer is that's why they were attacking us, precisely because we didn't live in Israel. It doesn't make any sense. But it makes a lot of sense because the Jewish people's connection to Israel is organic. The Midrash uses the analogy of a tailor-made suit. You can't take a tailor-made suit that was designed for one individual and measured to conform to all his features and all his contours. You can't use that suit for someone else. It won't fit. You'd have to stretch it out. You'd have to cut it down. It just won't fit. Land of Israel was given to the Jewish people, and no one else will fit in the land. And this organic relationship is so tight that nobody could conquer it. Even when the Romans conquered it, even when the Ottomans conquered it, even when the Muslims conquered it, when the Christians conquered it, it still remained the land of Israel. Nobody was able to colonize the land. And that's what unnerved the nations. It was so disquieting to them. That was so troubling to them. You mean that this land is yours even when you're not there? We never lost our connection to the land of Israel. And the fact that we experienced and manifested that connection at a time when Jews were not even living there as a nation, just a handful of Jews, that demonstrated that Israel is the only country in the world that cannot be conquered by anyone else. It is eternally the Jewish people, and that's what gets them upset. They can't tolerate that. They can't stomach that. So it's not because we're occupying the land, it's because they know that the connection that we have to the land is a permanent connection. Even as we gave away, incorrectly I believe, Gaza to the Arabs, they still feel it's our land. We're occupying it. We're not occupying, we withdrew from it. They know the truth that it is still our land, and they can do nothing to take it away from us. And that's what is so upsetting to them. So that's one explanation why Israel is so connected to the Jewish people. They realize that the anti-Semites are smarter than a lot of us. We don't always realize the depth of a connection to Israel. The anti-Semites know it. And that's our hatred of Jews, and the hatred of Israel is really one thing because we are so tightly connected. But on a deeper level, when God gave us the Torah, as I mentioned before, the idea of the Torah was to make the world a dwelling place for God. Make the whole world a godly world, not just Israel, not just Jerusalem. But the model for that, and the place where we can fulfill most of the commandments, which we can't do outside of Israel, is in Israel. The fact that we have 613 commandments is true in theory, because in practice we don't have the ability to fulfill most of the commandments unless you live in Israel with the Beit HaMikdash, with the Holy Temple. So Israel is not just a land that is connected to the Jewish people. It is the very land through which the very purpose of creation is fulfilled. It's the paradigm, it's the model for the rest of the world. And to the extent that Israel is strong and houses the Jewish people in the proper manner, that strengthens the plan that God had for the world, and it hastens the end of exile and the end of the domination of the nations, and the beginning of the Messianic age. And evil cannot tolerate that. Evil, which is what anti-Semitism is, it's pure evil, incarnated in these individuals without them realizing why they hate so much. Evil doesn't want to go out of business. And Israel is the place which represents how God will succeed and take over the world, and the world will be absent all of its evil. And evil is fighting that. It's its last stand, and that's why it's manifesting such hatred to the Jewish people, because Israel is the place that represents the ultimate goal. And that's what bothers them most about the Temple Mount. They know the Temple Mount belongs to us. They know that. They may deny it publicly, but they know the truth. That's why it bothers them so much. And therefore they feel that that's an end to their domination, to their hegemony, and they know the truth. So that's the power of Israel that was given to Abraham. The very inception of the Jewish people through Abraham, God already tells him about the fact that he will be the one to have the land of Israel belong to his progeny. At the end of the Torah portion, the Torah speaks of circumcision. And what does God tell Abraham when he tells him to circumcise himself? He says, walk before me and be perfect. What did God mean by perfect? So Rashi explains, at present you are deficient in 5 body parts, 2 eyes, 2 ears, and the male organ. I will add a letter unto your name. Abram became Avraham, an extra letter He, which is 5. And the total of your letters, if you add all the letters of the word Avraham, will be 248, equal to the number of your body parts. In other words, circumcision and the addition of the letter He to his name made Abraham's body perfect. That now he was in control of all of his bodily faculties. They would all be attuned to God's will. What does this Rashi tell us? That circumcision represents making the body whole and perfect. Most people, when they think about religion, all religions, including Judaism, focus on the neshama, the soul. We always talk about the soul. The soul is a part of God. The soul is holy. We want the soul to be revealed. And much of Judaism is geared to revealing the power of the soul. But Judaism also believes in the sanctity of the body. The body needs the soul to educate it so that its sanctity should not be suppressed. It should be revealed. Because without the soul, the body could degenerate. So that's what circumcision is. Circumcision is a mitzvah that points to the fact that the body is holy, or can be holy if it lives in accordance with God's commandments. And circumcision is that commandment that underscores that notion. There's another mitzvah that affects the body more than any other mitzvah. That's a twin with circumcision, and that's the mitzvah of tefillin. Now, women, the Talmud says, are considered circumcised. In other words, a woman is created with a body that is much more receptive to God's will than a man. So while the man requires circumcision, the woman does not require it. Tefillin is also something we put on our body, and it actually makes a mark. If you ever see someone who puts the tefillin on his arm, there'll be an indentation in the arm. And I'd like to share a story, a very powerful story in the Holocaust. There was a Jew who smuggled a pair of tefillin into the camp, and he hid it in a certain building, not his own barracks where he slept. And every day he would sneak into that building, risking his life, put on the tefillin for a minute, and then sneak back to his barracks. And one day he was caught by a capo. He was, I think, a Ukrainian guard, a real vicious anti-Semite who loved to torture the Jews and murder them. He was no better than the Nazis. And he caught this Jew sneaking out of that location where he put on tefillin, and he confronts him. He says, "Where were you? What were you doing?" And the Jew, it didn't make sense to lie. He was going to kill him one way or another if he wanted to. He says, "I went to put on tefillin." It's a religious thing. He says, Don't tell me what tefillin is. I know what tefillin are. I lived amongst Jews, and I don't believe that you Jews would risk your life for your religion. And I can prove to you one way or another if you put on the tefillin, because I know, I've seen this, that when Jews put on tefillin after the services, their arms have indentation from the strap that ties tightly around the arm. Roll up your sleeve. And he rolled up his sleeve, and in fact, he had those indentations. It doesn't take much to create them. And this capo grabs the Jew. He says, "Come with me to your barracks." And he thought he's going to shoot him or strangle him in front of all the other Jews. And he says to the Jewish people there, he says, "You see this Jew? He risked his life for his religion, for his God. From now on, anyone who touches him, who harms him, I will personally kill that person." So this is an incredible story, how a Jew risked his life and how it had an effect on this vicious anti-Semitic capo. At any rate, we have these two mitzvahs that are said to be the two witnesses that we are Jews. One witness is circumcision, and the other witness is tefillin. And that's one of the reasons we don't wear tefillin on Shabbat, because Shabbat is also a sign. Now, all these mitzvahs, the circumcision, tefillin, and Shabbat all relate to the body. Shabbat, we understand, is a time when we're supposed to enjoy ourselves. We're supposed to drink, make kiddush on wine. We eat meat, if we enjoy eating meat, and we enjoy ourselves. Oneg Shabbat. But then tefillin makes this indentation on our flesh. We wear it on our head and on our arm, and the Talmud says, a person who doesn't put on tefillin, it's a sin to his body. You didn't treat your body the way you should have. The body becomes defective. And likewise, circumcision affects the body. Now, it's interesting, according to one midrash, when was Abraham commanded, or when did he circumcise himself? There were different opinions, but in one midrash called Seder Olam, it says it was on the 13th day of the month of Nisan. What is significant about that day in the Torah? In the book of Esther, we're told that that was the day that the king Achashverosh allowed Haman to issue the edict in the king's name to annihilate all the Jews. What was the difference between Haman, who wanted real genocide, and the Greeks in the days of Chanukah? We have these two rabbinic holidays, Purim and Chanukah. Purim we celebrate with drinking, with feasting. Chanukah we celebrate primarily with lighting candles. So the commentators point out that the difference is the objective of these anti-Semites. What did the Greeks want? The Greeks did not want to destroy our bodies. The Greeks wanted to destroy our soul. They wanted to Hellenize us. They wanted us to assimilate into their culture, into their ideology, into their paganism. So we celebrate it with light. Light is a symbol of spirituality. On the other hand, what did Haman want? Haman wanted literally to annihilate every man, woman, and child, the same way Hamas today and Hezbollah today say that they want. They want genocide. And when you see these demonstrations in America, what are they calling for? They're calling for from the river to the sea. What does that insinuate? What does that imply? Total destruction of the Jewish people. And they say that openly. And it's a terrible shame that governmental leaders and university leaders equivocate about this, and they're not taking it seriously. It's unheard of. Imagine if people would get together and call for the annihilations of another minority. This would be these people would never see the light of day. But when people call for the annihilation of the Jewish people, people take it in stride. And tragically, even Jewish leaders are guilty of this, not protesting it sufficiently. At any rate, Haman was against the Jewish body. He knew, he had an uncanny realization that there's something unique, not just about the Jewish soul, which he was against as well, but there's something about the Jewish body, because the Jews don't just glorify the soul. We believe the body has holiness in it, sometimes suppressed, sometimes hidden, sometimes not allowed to manifest itself. And he couldn't tolerate that. So one of the things that Haman was against he was against the Jewish body, but one of the things specifically was circumcision. That's why it says in the Megillah that after his defeat and and everything was reversed, it says the Jewish people had light. Light refers to Torah. Simcha refers to the holidays. Sasan refers to circumcision. Vikar and glory refers to Tefillin, because these are all things that relate, except for Torah, that relate to the body. Celebration of holidays, which is like Shabbos, circumcision, and Tefillin all relate to the body. So when did this happen? When did this decree, when was it issued, which highlights the Jewish body on the same day Abraham circumcised himself, to highlight this idea that Judaism considers the body to be holy as well. And in Hasidic literature, we're taught that in the Messianic age, instead of the soul giving light to the body's true godly nature will inspire the soul. It's like a teacher and a student. The teacher is the one who inspires and educates and edifies the student, but the student eventually could become the source of knowledge to the teacher as well.